Hey, it's Delphi, and in this video, I wanted to talk to you about grief and loss. One of the things I talk about in my book, Answers in the Dark, is that if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that grief doesn't just belong to death. I think we as a society have come to believe that when we talk about grief and grieving, we're referencing specifically a bereavement, the death of a loved one. And whilst that is obviously the case, I think it's important for us to acknowledge and recognise that loss can be experienced when anything that matters to us is no longer there. And for that reason, we can essentially grieve for the things that we have lost and loved. So in this video, I wanted to talk you through what might help, what perhaps doesn't help, especially in terms of ways that other people interact with us and the way that other people tend to deal with us when we're going through a difficult time, with a view to maybe expanding that conversation around what's more helpful when someone's going through a difficult time. When we talk about loss, I think it's really important to recognise that there are things that we can experience in life which would amount to a significant loss, but without anybody dying. And so I'm thinking in this context of, for example, a relationship breakdown or a redundancy, even a child leaving home to go to university, to some extent can be experienced as a loss, not always necessarily with the same intensity as it might be with a bereavement, but certainly we can experience that sense of loss of something that mattered to us which is no longer there, and for that reason we may grieve for it. I think as a society we don't tend to recognise that so much. I think, as I said earlier, we tend to think of grief as something which is unique to the death of a loved one. But when we start to expand that conversation into recognising that actually we can grieve for anything that matters to us that's no longer there, we can start to recognise and understand perhaps the ways that we respond to difficulty, especially if society isn't allowing or giving us permission to grieve for those things that matter to us that are no longer there. So if, for example, we're not given permission to grieve for a relationship breakdown because we're met with things from our friends and family like, oh, there's plenty more fish in the sea, that in itself can be quite minimising and quite dismissive for an individual who's going through a difficult time. So I think making space for recognising how grief affects us all differently and uniquely, but at the same time encouraging us to incorporate into that the different ways that loss and grief can show up. So not just the death of a loved one, but actually in other types of losses that we might experience and realistically grieve for. One of the things that people have often said to me over the last 20 years when I've been working with grieving people and people going through a difficult time was the way that other people responded to them was often quite minimising or dismissive of their experience or their emotions in that moment. So I'm thinking about how, as a society, we have this tendency to try and cheer people up when we know they're feeling sad, for example. And yet what people have told me is when someone does that, I'm thinking about when people start sentences with words like at least. So when a relationship breaks down, when someone says, at least you're still young, you can always get remarried. When a person is on the receiving end of that kind of statement, even if it's well intentioned, it often feels quite minimising. And what they actually hear the other person saying is, I don't want to hear your pain. I don't feel comfortable with you talking about this, so please stop talking. And of course, that's not how we should be navigating somebody's feelings when they're going through a difficult time. We should be making space for those if we feel we have the capacity to do so. So one of the things I encourage people to have a think about when they come into contact with someone who is grieving or going through a difficult time is to think instead about ways that they can acknowledge and validate those person's feelings. You could start with saying, I'm so sorry this has happened, or you could offer something like, it makes sense that you feel that way. So at the same time, you're acknowledging how that person feels, but without feeling like you need to cheer them up out of what they're feeling. It's so important that people have permission to feel what they feel when they're going through a difficult time. And of course, another thing that we can do if we don't know what to say is to simply say that. We could just say, I don't know what to say. I'm just so glad you told me. So these are different ways that we can navigate conversations with people when they're going through a difficult time, but without feeling like we need to fix them in that moment. I think when we talk about grief, it's also important to look at the different ways that our feelings show up. I think that there's been some conversation around the idea that when we're grieving, we go through these particular stages, and that these feelings will look like shock and denial, eventually working their way towards acceptance. And one of the things I talk about in Answers in the Dark is that there are no stages of grief. Everybody is different. Everyone will experience that journey differently. And yes, whilst we might experience things like shock and denial, for example, they can show up at any point during that process. It doesn't necessarily mean they're at the very beginning or at the very end. And I think it's important that we allow for that. I often say that grief is more like a roller coaster than it is a flight of stairs. It's certainly not a linear process that's going to be straightforward and, like a series of gates that we just need to pass through and then tie it all up in a neat pile at the end. So I think that's one thing, is to consider that we don't necessarily experience grief in a particularly linear fashion. But I also think it's important to recognise when we think about our feelings that those might surprise us as well. So again, we might recognise numbness, we might recognise anger, all as emotions that we might experience when we're going through the grieving process. But we might also experience jealousy, we might experience relief. And I think these are things that we perhaps don't tend to talk about when we're going through a difficult time, because those feelings themselves might be seen as negative, and yet necessarily they are something that we should be able to talk about. So I think when we're talking about feelings and grief, I think it's important to recognise that all emotions are valid, they all have their own intelligence, but it's what we do with those feelings that's going to make the difference to our recovery or our feelings of connection or not. And so this is one of the reasons why I wanted to recommend some videos to you. Whether you are someone who is trying to help someone at the moment who's grieving or going through a difficult time, or whether you yourself are experiencing that right now. First of all is a video by Megan Devine, which is How to Help a Grieving Friend. She offers some incredible insight around how important it is that we provide acknowledgement for someone without this almost like this instinct to cheer someone up when they're going through something difficult. Instead, we can just acknowledge and hold that space for them in a safe and reassuring way. Another video is by Brené Brown. It's a short video on empathy where she talks about those statements around how unhelpful it can be to use the words at least, how minimising that can be, and also how to say things like, I'm so glad you told me, in a way to validate somebody's experience. That can be incredibly important when they're going through a difficult time. And last but not least is a video by Nora McInerney. It's a TED talk. It's about 20 minutes that you can watch. And she talks about the language that we use around bereavement and grief, and particularly when we can steer away from saying things like moving on or getting over it. We really want to try and steer away from language like that, which implies that grief is just something you forget, or the person is someone that you just forget. Instead, we can use language like we find our way forward or we move forward in our grief, rather than implying that a person should be moving on. Those shoulds can be quite difficult to hear when a person's going through a difficult time, because it implies that they're somehow getting grief wrong. And of course, that's just not the case. There is no right way to grieve. And so it's important that we give people the time and space to find their way forward, and especially not try and rush them when they're going through a difficult time. In terms of what people find helpful, of course, there is no prescription that anyone can write or a definitive list of what will work. But there are things that people have said to me over the years that they found helpful. And one in particular was having a routine. So that might be setting your alarm every day to get up at a specific time. It might be making sure that you're in bed and focusing on getting a good night's sleep at the same time every evening. It might be making sure that you make space for breakfast, lunch and dinner, or it might be going for a walk every day and just getting some fresh air. But certainly an element of routine can be quite helpful for some, and it's one reason why some people go back to work quite quickly after a bereavement, because it gives them that sense of structure and a sense of routine when everything else just feels quite chaotic around them. Doesn't work for everybody, but some people do say they find that helpful. Other things to think about are restorative acts of self-care. I've done a whole video on what self-care is and what self-care isn't. But for example, it might be having time with friends and family, or it might be usefully taking a step back and spending time quietly on your own. Some people find being around other people quite energizing, but other people might find it quite draining. And especially if you feel like you need to step back from some of the chaos at the moment, you might find that a daily restorative act of self-care for you just looks like having a cup of tea quietly somewhere and maybe reading a magazine. So it looks different for everybody, but certainly seeing what that might look like for you could be helpful. And then last but not least is certainly being gentle on yourself. Rather than trying to think of grieving as having a specific time frame, try not to feel like you have to work to somebody else's time scale with grief. Certainly when you're navigating difficult times, it can be important to be gentle on yourself and give yourself the time and space that you need, rather than feeling like you need to rush yourself out of whatever it is that you're feeling right now. As always, of course, you could speak to your doctor. You might find that they are particularly useful in signposting you to services locally, but most of all, think about what might work healthily and helpfully for you as you find yourself through this difficult time. I hope that's useful. Feel free to have a look at my other videos on YouTube at Delphi Ellis. I look forward to catching up with you soon.